Good morning. Welcome to Encompass Church. If I have not met you, my name is Kevin Clark. I'm the senior pastor. I'm usually hanging out on the landing in the lobby after we're finished here, so if you'd like to introduce yourself, I'd love to get the chance to meet you. We had promised that we would have baptisms today. As sometimes happens, people pick a different date for family reasons and things like that. So those baptisms have just been postponed. We'll let you know when they're coming, probably middle of February. For years, our routine on Sunday mornings has been for all of our families with children to check their kids in somewhere in the lobby, drop their babies and toddlers off in their classrooms, and bring the older kids in here for worship. And then we would dismiss those kids to their classrooms before we began this adult teaching time. And the teachers would wait for the kids to arrive, and then they would start their classes. Now this year, as those of you who are parents undoubtedly know, kids' classes are all beginning at the same time we start in this room, and the kids do have worship in their classes, so you can take your kids straight to class when you arrive. But some parents have asked the question, is it still okay for my kids to come in here to worship before they go to their classes? And the answer is yes, of course. However, you should know that the teachers will already be in the middle of their teaching when your kids leave here. They will not be waiting for them to arrive to get started. So we are going to ask you, if your kids come here first, that you walk them to their classrooms. Please don't just say, bye, see you later. Please actually walk them, and that includes the kids who know the way. Here's the reason. We love your kids. We just went through a capital campaign. We're doing construction in order to make space for kids. We're typically running in January 120 plus kids every single week, and that is growing every day. Your kids, their safety is a primary concern for us, and we have no rescue party to locate your little lost princes and princesses if they linger in the bathrooms or roam in the hallways, or decide to go outside and explore, especially in a couple of months when there will be really cool heavy equipment parked in our parking lot. We know that your children are all perfectly obedient at home, but our campus is full of lots of distractions, and even the saintliest child can be tempted. So it is your responsibility to get them to their classes, and we will take it from there. In 1804, U.S. Army captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and the Corps of Discovery were sent by President Thomas Jefferson to follow the Missouri River to its northern source and to locate what was called the Northwest Passage, a water route believed to exist that would connect to the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. If such a route actually had existed, then it would prove to be an economic boon for our country or whoever got there first. 15 months after they departed, Meriwether Lewis found himself standing at a small spring, which was one of the sources of the Missouri River near the Canadian border, and he and his men stepped over the next ridge, expecting to see a long and gradual slope headed towards the west coast and the Columbia River, which they were planning to canoe to get out to the Pacific Ocean. Instead, they were stunned to see mile after never-ending mile of ever higher peaks that formed the Rocky Mountains. Their expedition had failed, or had it. In the days that followed, the Corps, which at that point numbered 32 men, had a big decision to make. Would they forge ahead even though the absence of a water route changed their purpose, or would they turn back? The decision that lay before them after such a long time of journeying north tested each man's resolve. But the 32 men were no longer acting as individuals with their own personal missions. a historian named Stephen Ambrose wrote this: "What Lewis and Clark and the men of the Corps of Discovery had demonstrated is that there is nothing that people cannot do if they get themselves together and act as a team. Here you have 32 men who had become so close that when they heard a cough at night, they instantly knew who had developed a cold. They knew men by their shapes in the dark. They knew who was the best shot, the fastest runner, who could start a fire quickest on a rainy day. And around the campfire at night, they got to know about each other's parents and loved ones and each other's hopes and dreams. They had come to love each other to the point where they would have sold their lives gladly to save a comrade. They developed a bond and together were able to accomplish feats that when we study them still astonish us today. Is there a parallel for those of us who are on the expedition to which Jesus has called us? Today is week 3 in the teaching series that we've been calling Expedition, Where Are You Going? And in this series, we're planning a trip, not just for our church, but for you as individuals that will point us in the right direction for the remainder of 2026. And so my challenge has been to each of you as you listen, not to treat this series just as information, but as preparation. I've said the first of the year is an ideal time to ask, where am I going and what must I do to get there? We've talked about the fact that some people make resolutions to exercise, to lose weight, to read more, to stress less, to learn a new life skill, to spend more time with family, to read the Bible, to pray, to join a small group, to serve in a ministry, to come to church more often on a regular basis, to be a better spouse, a more committed parent, a more productive worker, to be a more responsible citizen. Who knows what your resolutions are or what they might have been if you had made them more intentional. And none of those things are bad. We should do most of them, but none of those are our primary mission as Christians. What is our primary mission? On week 1, we learned that though each of us have our own important responsibilities and callings, including some of the things that I just listed, every Christian has the same primary underlying mission. In Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, Jesus laid it out very clearly. He said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Before Jesus left his disciples and ascended to heaven to be with the Father following his crucifixion and his resurrection, he said explicitly, "Go, make disciples, baptize them, teach them." And it is clear, as we explored in the first week of the series, from the text and the context, that his command was not just for the men standing in front of him. His command was intended for every Christian of every generation, in every place and every time. Our primary underlying mission, both mine and yours, is to make disciples. I told you as a church, our mission statement explains it this way. We say Encompass Church exists to honor God by developing more disciple-making followers of Jesus Christ. Our church exists to make disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. It is the church's job to make disciples, but you are the church. What would it look like if we as individuals who make up the church were actually personally involved in developing new disciples? We would see 4 things beginning to happen, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those that we were introducing to Jesus Christ. And those 4 things are listed in our vision statement. Our vision statement is a picture of what we will look like if we are accomplishing our mission. And ours says this: Encompass Church will be a place where people discover a vibrant relationship with Jesus Christ, connect with caring, like-minded believers, grow in spiritual, emotional, and relational maturity, and serve each other, the local community, and the world together. So discover, connect, grow, and serve. How do we as disciples learn how to do that ourselves, but also to pass that on to the next generation, the people we have personally been called to disciple? Last week, we unpacked what it means to discover a vibrant relationship with Jesus Christ and to help others do that. Today, I'm going to unpack what it looks like to connect with caring, like-minded believers and to help new disciples do that too. But before I do, like I did last week, I'd like you to hear from one of our church staff. So Melissa, would you join me up here on stage? Good morning. Melissa is our women's ministry director. And so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about those 4 words. And I'm hoping I remember the order you asked me to do them in. Was discover the first one? All right, let's do that. How does women's ministry help women to discover a vibrant relationship with Jesus Christ?
I first heard about Encompass Church from a friend about 6 years ago who was starting a Bible study. At the time, I was a tired mom of 2 kids, and I didn't have much community, and I honestly had no idea what I was doing. The Village met me right where I was at. There are mentor moms who had already walked through the season that I was in, and fellow moms who were in it, the thick of it with me. It was a safe place that met me where I was at. Through fellowship and studying God's Word together, we are able to discover a brighter, more vibrant relationship with Jesus.
Awesome. All right. How about how does women's ministry help women to serve?
So we'll circle back to the Village. There is always a pregnant mom or 2 in the Village. And of course, we do the little meal sign up and little gifts are given to celebrate the new babies. But women seriously fight to hold each other's children. By the time I had 3 kids, 10 minutes of space was priceless. Moms who seemed like they had nothing left to give are able to serve each other. Also, this fall, the Village made welcome bags for Parker Valley Hope. It's a drug and alcohol rehab here in town. It included gum, candy, journals, but most of all, there was a gospel track and an invite to church. Their heart was to reach people who were at their lowest and share the hope that they had in Christ.
Help women to grow in spiritual, emotional, and relational maturity.
That's a mouthful. On Friday, February 6th, we'll be hosting an event called Tacos and Testimonies. This event is going to be 3 parts. The first, we'll talk about what exactly is a testimony. Second, we'll have time to write out our testimonies. Sharing on the spot can be really intimidating if we haven't had time to reflect beforehand. And finally, in small groups, we'll practice sharing our testimonies with each other. Whether you're confident in doing that or you're not even sure you have a testimony, I really encourage you to grow in that spiritual, emotional, and relational maturity.
All right. And last, because we're talking about connection today, how does women's ministry help the ladies connect with caring, like-minded believers?
The biggest event I've ever planned is my kid's birthday party before the women's Christmas gathering this year. This past December, we hosted 100 women. And let me tell you, planning food and space for 100 women is no joke. After planning all the details, the women really appreciated them, but what they really needed was time and space to connect. That's exactly what happened. After the gathering, several women came up to me and said they never even left their tables. They were able to finally catch up with old friends or get to know people that they only see on Sundays. The decorations and the desserts mattered far less than that time of connection.
That's awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Let's give her a round of applause. Melissa does a fantastic job. She's new to the job, and so she's learning on the run, and she has a great team surrounding her, so they're picking up all the slack and helping her do this with great excellence, so we appreciate you. Discover, connect, grow, and serve are very simple words with very simple meanings, but if you put them in the hands of someone like Jesus Christ, then you discover they also have a power to transform us far more than any New Year's resolution would ever have the power to do. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app, I'm going to ask you to turn to Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. What does it actually mean to connect with other caring, like-minded believers, especially in ways that transform us into fully devoted followers of Christ and also enable us to connect other people with one another as we are moving toward a higher level of discipleship? Last week we read how Jesus walked down a beach at the Sea of Galilee and he called his first 4 disciples. Today we're going to see him calling his 5th. Jesus was on the move. The crowds were growing. He was speaking truth. He was performing miracles, but he was also generating quite a bit of controversy. Word had spread quickly. This guy is worth seeing and hearing. And so many people were coming from many places to see and hear Jesus. He was swarmed by those who wanted a piece of his time for their particular need. But in the middle of all that, he stopped to speak directly to a person that most in the crowd probably thought Jesus would naturally avoid. So look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he, Matthew, rose and followed Jesus. Now, this is the first mention of Matthew, or Levi, as he's called in other Gospels. And since it's the first mention of him by name, we naturally assume it was the first time he met Jesus. But most Bible scholars think that Matthew was at least familiar with Jesus' teaching and might have met him and spoken to him face to face in the past. Because when someone like Jesus came into town, everybody wanted to see him. Last week we read in Matthew 4, verses 23 and 24, it said, and he, Jesus, went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria. So by the time Jesus actually walked up and spoke to Matthew, he had traveled across Galilee, the region which was the center of his ministry for the first part of his ministry, and his fame had also spread to Syria, which was the Roman province or state that also encompassed Galilee. Even people who had never seen Jesus in person had heard about him and they wanted to know more. We also know from the context of the verses that it is extremely likely that Matthew lived in Capernaum, which is the city which was Jesus's home base in the first part of his ministry. If you lived in the city where Jesus was walking around and teaching and healing and doing all kinds of things like that, you would undoubtedly eventually go to see and hear him. And that's probably what happened with Matthew. But on this day, as Jesus passed the tax booth, he actually stopped and spoke to Matthew directly. And he said, "Follow me." Those in the crowd who heard what he said, knowing this was the invitation of a rabbi to become a disciple, would have undoubtedly been shocked. When Jesus said to Matthew, "Follow me," he wasn't saying, join this big crowd that's trailing me all over the city. He was saying, leave this life behind, become my disciple, go where I go, eat what I eat, sleep where I sleep, do what I do, say what I say. And everybody who heard Jesus knew that that was the call that he was issuing. give everything up. But they weren't shocked by what Matthew would have to give up. What most shocked the crowd was that Jesus had chosen a man like Matthew. Matthew had none of the qualities that a God-honoring, self-respecting Jewish rabbi would desire in a disciple. I told you last week that it was not uncommon for teaching religious teachers, they called them rabbis, to wander the countryside and to gather disciples and to stop in certain cities or to set up a base and from there to train those disciples. But most rabbis sought out young men who appeared to be devoted already to following God's law, who could answer complicated questions about it. And it was even better if they could bring attention to the rabbi because of their own family's wealth or education or influence. Most Jewish rabbis were looking for the best of the best as disciples, and Matthew was not the best of the best. He was undoubtedly educated, or he would not have had the position that he had. He was probably wealthier than most because he did have the position, and it is likely that he came from an influential family. But Matthew was a tax collector, and tax collectors, in the eyes of the Jews, were traitors. They were Jews who got their jobs by bribing the Roman officials, and in exchange for collecting taxes for Rome, they could charge almost whatever fee they wanted to charge, and they could keep the fee for themselves. As long as Caesar got his cut, the local Roman government really didn't care how much a tax collector got from the people who were paying the taxes. So tax collectors were a little bit like a local mafia, Jews extorting money from their Jewish neighbors. And on top of that, tax collectors were almost universally considered to be religiously unclean. The Jews, by the Old Testament law, were not permitted to enter the temple for a period of time after they had touched something unclean, like the body of a dead animal. If they touched something unclean, they had to perform a ritual washing, and typically they had to wait until the next calendar day, which began at sunset for the Jews, before they would be considered clean again. Touching a Gentile or a non-Jew or his money made you unclean. And since taxmen touched Gentiles and their money all day long, they were considered to be ritually unclean almost all of the time. So Matthew had nothing that a rabbi would seek in a disciple. What did Jesus' call to such a man tell the crowd? And what can it tell us? It should have told them and us that the call to follow Jesus is open to all who will respond. The call to follow Jesus is open to all who will respond. Prior to their expedition, Lewis and Clark had served together for 6 months in the same larger army unit, and though they were not known to have been good personal friends, they did know of each other. They had sized each other up. They knew each other to be an excellent leader. And when President Jefferson challenged Lewis to lead the expedition, Lewis immediately asked him to pull Clark out of retirement and to make him Lewis's co-captain. Jefferson agreed without reservation, and so Lewis wrote to Clark and said, here's the offer. The president has said if you join us, you'll get to do all this great stuff and you'll get to be a captain. But the army refused to honor the promise. Like the Jews in Galilee, who were probably shocked at Jesus' choice of Matthew, a tax collector, a traitor, a lesser man, the army saw Clark to some degree as a lesser man and would offer him only the rank of lieutenant. Though under pressure, they did agree to pay him a captain's salary. Lewis was furious. He had chosen Clark. He had seen in Clark the potential to be a leader like himself. And so for the entire expedition, he and the men of the corps referred to Clark as captain. And except when they were separated, which they did for a period of time, they each took a team in a different direction. They made all of their leadership decisions jointly as a connected pair. In the eyes of Jesus, though each one of us is called to specific roles, we are all seen as part of connected groups of believers. None of us is more qualified to receive salvation than any other. In fact, it's often said, God does not call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And he does so not just for our own sakes as individuals, but also to form the networks of connection that enable us to carry out the primary mission he has given us to carry out. Now, we might picture Matthew as kind of an anomaly. In the back of my head, I think to myself, he probably didn't like being a tax collector. He was one of the rare good ones. He was stuck against his will in an unfortunate job. Probably the other tax collectors didn't like him, and he was longing to escape. But that doesn't play out in Scripture. That doesn't really fit what we see. Shortly after he agreed to follow Jesus, which he did in the moment he was asked to follow, Matthew threw a big party and he invited many friends to meet Jesus. Look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 10. It says, "And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples." So immediately after Jesus calls Matthew, the next lines, we see that there is a big party, and we see that there are a lot of tax collectors and people with questionable reputations. And the Gospel of Luke is explicit and says that Matthew or Levi was the host who invited them all. Matthew was not a reluctant tax collector with no friends. He had friends. He just did not have the kind of friends that polite Jewish society would consider to be the right crowd. He was part of what they would call the wrong crowd. He was a wealthy and successful person who had become an outsider to Jewish culture and who had probably, for the most part, withdrawn from the public practices of the Jewish faith. Now, you and I are called as our primary underlying mission to make disciples, and not just of those who look like they already have one foot in the door of the church and already have an interest in faith, but also those who look like they do not. We are called to invite them to meet Jesus. How many people do you personally know well that you have assumed without evidence they would say no to Jesus? Have you ever actually invited them to meet him? Jesus looked at Matthew and he saw a man who, despite his external appearance and how he was viewed by the people of his culture, was willing to give everything up to have a real experience of God's kingdom. After Matthew said yes to Jesus, he hosted the party. And we don't know if the party was Jesus's idea or if it was Matthew's idea. I sometimes imagine Jesus introducing Matthew to the other four disciples. And he's a tax collector. They hate tax collectors. And they're fishermen. I can imagine they all had their arms crossed and looked very stern. And Jesus said, "You need to get to know each other. And I'd like to meet your friends, Matthew. So why don't we just have a big party tonight and we can all hang out together and talk?" In the earliest moments of his fledgling faith in Jesus, Matthew realized that his new life was going to be all about relationships. And to live it would require the ability to connect with caring, like-minded believers. Even the stern four who were fishermen with rough hands who were staring him down, he was going to have to learn how to connect with them. You and I often treat following Jesus as if it is an individual sport. We believe that we can live the Christian life in isolation, just Jesus and me. If anyone could have argued that successfully, it would have been the original disciples of Jesus. They could have said, I actually have Jesus right here with me. I don't need the rest of you clowns. I'm just going to stay here with him. But Jesus, even in that context of close connection with himself, said, you need each other. And at the end of his time with them, before he ascended to be with the Father, he told them the need would be greater after he left, that they must love each other. John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, Jesus says this, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Jesus said, when I am gone, if you are my followers, you must stay connected to each other. Real connection requires real love for each other. Sometimes we will jokingly say, I love that Christian brother, I just don't like him. And we give ourselves a pass to get out of loving other believers the way that Jesus explicitly commanded us to do. By love, Jesus was not speaking of a reluctant goodwill, a love that says, sure, if they need something and they actually ask me personally and I have some extra time or some extra cash, yeah, I'll help, but I'm not going to go out of my way to get to know him and to do anything for him. But Jesus, when he said love one another, he used the Greek word agape for love. And it's a selfless, unconditional, sacrificial kind of love, the kind of love that God has for you and for me. It puts the needs of the other person first. And so a wholehearted, fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ will demonstrate that kind of connection and love for like-minded believers. So ask yourself this: if I don't really have that kind of love for any other Christians except perhaps my own family, why not? On the night he commanded his disciples to love one another, he also engaged in a demonstration that was mind-boggling to them. He showed the kind of love he meant by washing their feet, the lowest and most disgusting job of the least worthy household slave. So our King, the sinless Son of God, loved 12 sinful men by putting their needs before his own. He demonstrated that love through an act of extraordinary humility. So we can say real connection requires real humility toward one another. In John chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, Jesus commanded his followers, that's us, not just the 12 guys he was talking to personally, to do the same, to live the same. He said this, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Now, was Matthew, who was a tax collector, showing love and humility to Jesus' other disciples on the night he invited them to the house for a party? We have no idea. The Bible doesn't give us the details about what was going on in their interdisciple interactions. But we do know that Matthew had just discovered a new relationship with Jesus, and he was already demonstrating a beginner's grasp of what it means to be connected with others who follow Jesus. How was he doing that? First, he was associating, and second, he was consecrating. Now, what does that mean? Jim Putnam is the author of a book that I have read multiple times. I think it's a fantastic book that teaches the basic principles of disciple making. It's called Disciple Shift. He says that connection with caring, like-minded believers requires associating in meaningful, non-superficial ways with other disciples of Jesus on a regular, ongoing, and intentional basis. Here's a quote. Association means that, like Jesus, we establish ongoing relational connections with those who have responded in faith to him. Jesus himself concentrated on developing close relationships with a few men. They walked the roads together. They went to synagogue together. They climbed the mountains together and spent time away from the pressures of daily life together. Together, as a small group of Christ followers, they internalized Jesus' beliefs, practices, and emotions. Can we put all that in a short sentence? Yes, we can. Real connection requires association, and by that I mean meaningful association with other believers. Matthew, at the earliest stage in his relationship with Jesus, had decided right away he was going to associate with other believers, and he was going to identify himself with Jesus and the other men who were following Jesus. So he invited his old friends to meet Jesus and Jesus' disciples, who were his new friends. He said, "These are my people now. I want you to meet them. They have a message you do not want to miss. It has already begun to change me." Those men, probably resistant to a tax collector in the early days, after a while accepted him, welcomed him, became brothers with him, and remained a part of his life from that moment until the end. They all enjoyed celebrations together. They faced hardships together. They associated with each other in public and in private. And everyone who watched, who observed what was going on and saw the deepness of their friendship, knew they belonged together and they knew they followed Jesus. Have you found your group with which you associate on a meaningful level? If not, when we finish today, out in the lobby, there are going to be a whole bunch of tables with small group leaders who will be out there to tell you about their group. So don't miss this opportunity. They're all in one place at one time. There's all kinds of teams and other groups. Stop by a few of those tables. Get to know some of those leaders. Find out what they're doing and see if it might be a good fit for you. See if it might be the place where you can plant the seeds of deeper connection. But here's the other piece that Putnam mentioned. He says real connection requires obedience to Jesus together. Now, he used a different word. He used the word consecration. Matthew, when he said yes to Jesus, essentially decided to consecrate himself to Jesus. Consecration was the act of making something pure and holy and fully devoted to the purpose or the mission for which it was designed. And Matthew said, I am fully devoted to that mission, and that mission requires me to obey Jesus wholeheartedly. He knew when he responded to Jesus' call to follow him that meant he was giving up everything. He was going to do exactly what Jesus did, and there would be no complaints, no backing out, no reservations. It would just be full obedience. It all came down to that one essential command, and that is obey me. By leaving his tax job and by following Jesus, he committed to that without holding back. Jim Putnam in that same book says consecration means that, like Jesus, we help people to obey God's teachings. We help to mold them into the kind of people who are fully devoted to Jesus. The invitation Jesus gave his disciples was not to accept Christ or just believe what Jesus taught. It was an invitation to follow him with all of their being in full and complete obedience. In fact, obedience, not profession, is what marks us as Jesus's followers. In John chapter 14, verse 15, Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." That's not a threat. That's actually a marker, a measure of your commitment. A person who loves me is going to keep my commandments because he loves me. Obeying God's teaching is not what saves us from our sin. There's no form of obedience that can save you from your sin. Only faith that Jesus' death on the cross paid the penalty for our sin can save us from our sin. But obedience following that moment of salvation shows that we are in the process of being changed, being sanctified, to use the biblical word. And unrepentant, ongoing disobedience may show that despite our remembering a moment where we thought we became a Christian, nothing has actually changed. But obedience is hard, especially hard when we're alone. We need connections with other Christ followers who know the temptations that we face, the struggles that we go through in order to be consistently obedient to Christ. Jesus said, it's your obedience, not your feelings, that show that you really love me. Now, some who were present at Matthew's dinner party had no love for Jesus and no interest in obeying his commands, which were actually God's commands. Yet they believed with a deep certainty in their minds that they were following God faithfully because they weren't tax collectors, because they weren't the sinners, the ones with the questionable reputations, because they followed a code, a law, a set of rules. Matthew chapter 9, verses 11 to 13 says this, and when the Pharisees saw this, that Jesus was eating with these people, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when Jesus heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. These Pharisees apparently stood outside the party, away from the crowd, to avoid being associated with the undesirables. Now, whether they were invited by Matthew because they were prominent citizens, or they had simply come to criticize Jesus because they heard there was a party going on, we don't know. We do know that they were highly, supremely confident that they were following God's law to the letter. And their interpretation of the law did not allow a righteous Jew to even eat inside of the threshold of a sinner's house. And so they waited for Jesus' disciples and they asked them, why does he eat with sinners? Now, the Gospel of Luke records the exact same interaction and the same question, but he's more specific, and there is a very important difference in the way the question is phrased and recorded in Luke. The Pharisees challenged the disciples and they asked, why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners? The word you is plural in the Greek. So the Pharisees are accusing not only Jesus, but his disciples. And by asking the question that way, they admitted they had already recognized the connection that existed between these disciples and Jesus. It's not just Jesus. They're saying, you guys are doing what he does, and you're doing it together. That makes you just as guilty as him. When the Pharisees' question was reported to him, Jesus responded, those who are sick in sin need me, not those who are well. Was Jesus saying, hey, the Pharisees have got this sin thing all figured out and they don't need me because they're free from sin? No, he was absolutely not saying that. They needed him as much, perhaps even more, than the other people who were sitting in the room, but they could not see or feel the reality of their own sin. I'm reading several books about Lewis and Clark. I'm enjoying the story. I'm sharing tidbits with you as we go. One of the books was written by a pastor in Southern California, and the purpose of his book is not just to tell the story, but to fold it into how we do ministry. And in the book, he pauses to tell the story of two 80-year-old men, Hal and Gus, and they come to his church regularly. Hal is completely blind, and Gus is a double amputee. And so when they come to church, Hal pushes Gus's wheelchair, and Gus directs Hal verbally. Together, connected with each other, caring, like-minded believers, they are helping each other to compensate for the blindness and lameness of the other. They are helping each other to get past the things that we would think we had all figured out that we do not. The Pharisees were not willing to develop any kind of relationship that would challenge them on their own devotion to Jesus or to God for that matter. They wouldn't allow anyone to do that for them because they didn't think they needed it. They thought they were doing just fine on their own. And by thinking that, they were blind and they were lame in their walk with God, and they wallowed in their sin. What we learn is that real connection requires the freedom to correct one another's sin. Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You think you follow God well. You think you don't need a doctor. But you can't see or feel your own sin, and you're unwilling to be in any kind of relationship with anyone who would be able to correct you because you live in spiritual isolation, disconnected from those who love to follow God. My followers connect with one another, with caring, like-minded believers, to show love and humility, to associate deeply and meaningfully, and to obey fully and wholeheartedly. Together, they correct each other when they get off the path, and that's why they're not blind and lame. Their connections with other believers also show that beyond the shadow of a doubt, they belong to me. When you and I are connected, like Lewis and Clark and the 32 men in the Corps of Discovery, like Hal and Gus, perhaps like your own small group, we no longer act like individuals living just for our own private missions. We naturally begin to experience what it means to have God's mission, the primary mission, to build connections with other believers, not just those who are already on the path where we are, but those we are mentoring and leading and developing as disciples, and showing the world that we all belong to Him. You bow your heads with me?